Jake Morrison walked through the dark corridors of Nexus Station with heavy steps. The metal floor rang under his boots as he moved deeper into the lower levels. He had come here to pick up a cargo shipment, nothing more. The job was simple and the pay was decent. But as he turned the corner near the old storage bays, he heard sounds that made his stomach turn. Voices were calling out numbers, big numbers, credits that could buy a small ship or a house on a nice planet. Jake knew what those voices meant even before he saw the crowd gathered in the wide space ahead. His hands formed fists at his sides as he watched the scene unfold. The auction blocks stood in the center of the room under harsh white lights. Beings from across the galaxy sat in chairs or stood around the edges, all watching as the seller brought out his goods. These were not machines or rare metals or precious stones. These were people, living, breathing, thinking people who had been turned into things to be bought and sold. Jake had seen slave markets before, during his time in the colony wars. He had thought those days were behind him. He had hoped the galaxy was better than this, but here, it was again, happening right in front of him. On one of the biggest trading stations in known space. The seller was a tall creature with green scales and cold yellow eyes. His name was Vex, and Jake had heard stories about him from other cargo haulers. Vex dealt in what he called exotic specimens. He traveled from world to world, taking people from their homes and families to sell them to the highest bidder. Jake wanted to leave. He wanted to walk away and pretend he had never seen this place. But something kept his feet planted on the metal floor. Maybe it was the memory of his sister Lucy, who had died trying to protect civilians during a raid on the outer colonies. Maybe it was just a basic human need to help when help was needed. The current item on the block was a young girl, who could not have been more than 16 years old by human standards. Her skin was a soft blue-silver color that seemed to glow under the lights. Her hair was white as snow and fell to her shoulders in gentle waves. But it was her eyes that caught Jake's attention. They were large and dark and filled with a sadness that ran deeper than any ocean. Vex pulled on the chain around her neck, forcing her to stand straighter. She wore simple gray clothes that were too big for her small frame. Her bare feet were dirty from walking on cold metal floors. When she looked up at the crowd, Jake saw something in her expression that reminded him of a wild animal that had been caged for too long. The seller began his pitch in the common trade language that most beings in the galaxy could understand. He called her Zira and said she was one of the last of her kind. The Vulcans had been a peaceful race that lived on a world rich in rare minerals. When the big mining companies came, the Vulcans tried to negotiate. They tried to share their planet and live in peace. But the companies wanted everything, and they took it. Zira had been just a child when her world died. She had watched her family and friends disappear in the flames and smoke of war. Now she was alone, passed from owner to owner, like a piece of furniture that nobody really wanted, but everybody thought might be worth something someday. Vex told the crowd about her special gifts. Vulcans could feel the emotions of others and sometimes even share their own feelings with people around them. Some owners used this ability to help them in business dealings. Others just enjoyed having a pet that could sense their moods and react accordingly. But Vex said this one was damaged goods. She would not use her powers when commanded. She did not smile or dance or sing for entertainment. She just sat quietly in whatever corner she was given and stared at nothing. Several previous owners had returned her, demanding their money back. The bidding started low. A few collectors showed mild interest, but most of the crowd seemed bored. Jake found himself studying the girl's face as the numbers slowly climbed. She did not react to the voices discussing her price or the hands pointing in her direction. She simply stood there and endured it all, with the patience of someone who had learned that fighting only made things worse. Then Jake saw who was winning the bid. Lord Macroth sat in the front row with his bodyguards on either side. Jake had heard stories about Macroth too, and none of them were good. The alien noble collected sentient beings like some people collected art or rare books. He kept them in cages on his private ship and brought them out to show off to guests at parties. The rumors said that Makroth's pets did not live very long. Some died from poor treatment. Others simply gave up and stopped eating. A few tried to escape and were killed as examples to the others. Jake had always hoped the stories were just spacer tales meant to scare new travelers. But looking at Makroth's cold smile as he raised his bid, Jake knew the rumors were probably true. The price kept climbing. Jake watched as other bidders dropped out one by one. Soon it was just Makroth and one other collector, a wealthy trader who dealt in exotic servants for the entertainment industry. Neither option was good for the girl, but Makroth was definitely the worst choice. Jake looked at his personal credit account on his wrist computer. He had been saving for months to buy upgrades for his ship and maybe take some time off to visit the Outer Rim worlds. The money represented years of dangerous cargo runs and long hours in space. It was everything he had worked for since leaving the military. But as he watched the girl's empty expression and remembered his sister's last words about always helping those who could not help themselves, Jake knew what he had to do. He raised his hand and called out a number that was higher than anything bid so far. The auctioneer looked surprised. Makroth turned in his chair to see who had dared to challenge him. Jake kept bidding. He used his ship as collateral when his credits ran out. He borrowed against future cargo contracts. He put everything he owned on the line for a girl he had never met and might never understand. But something deep in his chest told him this was right. This was what Lucy would have wanted him to do when the final hammer fell. Jake Morrison owned a scared alien girl who had been treated like garbage by every person she had ever known. He had no idea what he was going to do next. He only knew that whatever happened, she deserved better than what she had been given so far. The Ironheart was not a fancy ship. Jake had bought it used from a retiring cargo hauler 5 years ago, and it showed its age in every scratched panel and worn control surface. The main corridor was narrow and lined with pipes and cables that hummed with the sound of working machinery. The air recyclers made a soft whooshing noise that never stopped, and the artificial gravity had a slight wobble that took new passengers a day or two to get used to. Jake led Zero through the ship without saying much. She followed behind him at a careful distance, her bare feet making no sound on the metal floor. Every few steps, she would glance around as if looking for escape routes or hidden dangers. Her whole body was tense and ready to run at the first sign of trouble. He stopped at a small cabin near the middle of the ship and opened the door. The room was basic but clean, with a narrow bed built into the wall, a small desk, and a storage locker for personal items. There was even a tiny window that showed the stars moving slowly past as the station rotated. Jake stepped back to let her look inside. Zero moved to the doorway, but did not enter. She examined the space carefully, checking the corners and looking for anything that might be a trap or a trick. After several long moments, she looked up at Jake with confusion in her dark eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small electronic keycard. Most ship doors could be locked from either side for privacy or security, and this card would give her complete control over her own space. Jake held it out to her without moving any closer. She stared at the key for a long time before slowly reaching out to take it. Her fingers were thin and delicate, and Jake noticed old scars around her wrists where chains or restraints had rubbed against her skin. When she touched the card, her hand shook slightly. Jake spoke quietly, keeping his voice calm and even. He told her that this was her room for as long as she wanted it. She could lock the door and he would not come in without permission. There was food in the galley that she was welcome to eat whenever she was hungry. The ship's computer had books, and movies, and games, in hundreds of languages, and she could access them from the terminal in her room. Most importantly, he said, she was not a prisoner. When they reached the next civilized system, she could leave if that was what she wanted. He would help her find transport to wherever she chose to go, or she could stay on the Iron Heart and travel with him. The choice was entirely hers. Zira listened to his words, but her expression did not change. She had heard promises before from people who claimed to be kind. Experience had taught her that kindness always came with a price, and the price was usually higher than she wanted to pay. She stepped into the room and immediately moved to the far corner, where she could see both the door and the window. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall and pulled her knees up to her chest. Jake watched her make herself as small as possible in the space, and his heart hurt for what she must have been through. He left her alone and went to the galley to prepare some food. The ship's database had information about Vulcan dietary needs, and Jake was relieved to discover that they could eat most of the same foods that humans enjoyed. He made a simple meal of bread, fruit, and protein paste, along with clean water, in a sealed container. When he returned to her room, he found the door closed and locked. He set the tray of food on the floor outside and knocked gently on the metal door. He told her the food was there and walked away without waiting for a response. This became their routine for the next several days. Jake would bring meals and leave them outside her door. Sometimes the tray would be empty when he came back, and sometimes the food would be untouched. He never asked questions or made demands. He simply provided what she needed and gave her space to heal. During the long hours of space travel, Jake went about his normal work. He checked the ship's systems, updated his navigation charts, and sent messages to potential clients about future cargo runs. The Ironheart was scheduled to make stops at 3 different systems over the next few weeks, and Jake wanted to make sure he had paying loads for each leg of the journey. Sometimes he would hear soft footsteps in the corridor. Late at night, when he was supposed to be sleeping, Zero was exploring the ship, learning its layout, and finding places where she felt safe. Jake pretended not to notice and made sure to stay in his own cabin during these times. On the 4th day, Jake found a small piece of paper slipped under his door. Written in careful letters using the common trade alphabet were 2 words in the Vulcan language. Jake ran them through the ship's translator and discovered they meant thank you. In her native tongue, he began leaving small gifts with the food trays. Nothing expensive or overwhelming, just simple things that might bring a moment of comfort to someone who had known very little kindness. A soft blanket from his own collection, a book of star charts with beautiful pictures of nebulae and distant galaxies, a small music player with gentle instrumental songs from a dozen different worlds. Slowly, very slowly, Zero began to emerge from her shell. Jake would catch glimpses of her in the galley early in the morning or late at night, quietly preparing her own meals. She started using the ship's computer terminal to access the educational databases, spending hours reading about history and science and literature. The breakthrough came during their 2nd week. Together, when the Ironheart's alarm system suddenly activated. Pirates had dropped out of hyperspace ahead of them and were demanding that Jake stop his ship for inspection. These were not official authorities but rather criminals who made their living robbing cargo haulers and passenger transports. Jake rushed to the bridge and began evasive maneuvers. But the pirate ship was faster and better armed than the Ironheart. Warning shots flashed past the viewports as Jake tried to think of a way to escape without getting them both killed. That was when Zira appeared beside his pilot chair. She had never been on the bridge before, and Jake was surprised to see her there. But instead of hiding in fear, she was studying the sensor displays with intense concentration. She spoke for the first time since coming aboard his ship. Her voice was soft and musical, with an accent that made common words sound like poetry. She told Jake that she could feel the emotions of the pirates through the metal walls of both ships. They were excited about the prospect of easy money, but they were also nervous because they had never robbed a ship with a Vulcan aboard. More importantly, she said, their leader was afraid. He had heard stories about what Vulcans could do to people's minds, and he was worried that she might use her abilities against him. If Jake could make him believe that she was dangerous and unpredictable, they might decide that robbing the Ironheart was not worth the risk. Jake looked into her dark eyes and saw something there that had not been present before. It was not hope exactly, but it was close. For the first time since he had bought her freedom, Zero was choosing to help instead of simply enduring whatever happened to her. Together, they convinced the pirates that attacking their ship would be a very bad idea. Jake played up the mysterious powers of his Vulcan companion, while Zero used her empathic abilities to project feelings of dread and unease toward the pirate vessel. The criminals decided to look for easier prey elsewhere and jumped back into hyperspace, leaving the Ironheart alone among the stars. After the immediate danger had passed, Jake and Zero sat in the ship's small observation lounge and shared a quiet meal together. It was the first time they had eaten in the same room, and Jake was careful not to make any sudden movements or ask too many questions. But as they watched the stars drift past the viewport, Zero began to talk. She told him about her homeworld and the crystal cities where her people had lived in harmony with nature. She described the gardens where she had played as a child and the songs her mother had sung to help her fall asleep. She also told him about the day everything ended. The mining ships had come without warning, and within hours her entire civilization had been reduced to rubble and ash. She had been captured while trying to help younger children escape, and from that moment her life had become a series of cages and chains and owners who saw her as nothing more than a curious object to be displayed. Jake listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he told her about his own losses during the colony wars and how guilt had driven him to become a cargo hauler, moving from system to system without ever really settling anywhere. For the first time since he had seen her on the auction block, Zero smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it was real, and in that moment, Jake knew that saving her had been the right choice, no matter what it might cost him in the future. Word traveled fast through the criminal networks that connected every port and station across the galaxy. Within days of the auction on Nexus Station, bounty hunters and mercenaries from a dozen different systems knew about the human who had stolen Lord Macroth's prize. Jake first learned about the bounty when he tried to refuel at Kepler Station. The docking master, an old friend named Pete, who had served with Jake during the colony wars, pulled him aside as soon as the Ironheart locked into its berth. Pete looked nervous as he checked to make sure nobody was listening to their conversation. He told Jake that 3 different groups of hunters had already been through the station asking questions about cargo ships and their recent departures. The bounty on Jake and Zero was higher than anything Pete had ever heard of, enough money to buy a fleet of ships or retire to one of the paradise worlds in the core systems. Jake felt his blood turn cold. He had known that Macroth would be angry about losing the auction, but he had not expected the alien noble to put such a massive price on their heads. This was not just about getting Zero back anymore. This was about making an example of anyone who dared to challenge Macroth's authority. He thanked Pete for the warning and quickly bought fuel and supplies for the Ironheart. As they prepared to leave Kepler Station, Jake noticed several ships that had not been there when they arrived. They were sleek hunter vessels with hidden weapon systems and high-powered engines, designed for pursuit and capture. Zero was waiting for him in the galley when he returned to the ship. Over the past few weeks, she had become more comfortable moving around the Ironheart, and Jake often found her reading in the common areas or helping with simple maintenance tasks. But today she looked worried, and Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. She told him that she had been sensing hostile emotions from the direction of the docking bays. Angry thoughts and violent intentions were focused on their ship like a spotlight cutting through the darkness. Someone was planning to hurt them, and that someone was getting closer. Jake sealed the ship and began the departure sequence as quickly as safety protocols would allow. The Ironheart pulled away from Kepler Station just as 2 hunter ships moved to intercept them. Jake pushed his engines to maximum power and jumped into hyperspace, with only seconds to spare. But hyperspace was not the sanctuary it had once been. Modern hunter ships carried tracking devices that could follow a vessel's hyperspace signature across multiple star systems. Jake would need to be much more clever if he wanted to keep Zira safe. Over the next few days, they played a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the trade routes and shipping lanes that connected the civilized worlds. Jake used every trick he had learned during his military service, dropping false sensor readings and changing course at random intervals to confuse their pursuers. Zira proved to be invaluable during these tense chases. Her empathic abilities allowed her to detect the emotions of their hunters even across the vast distances of space. She could tell Jake when they were getting close and which direction the danger was coming from. More than once, her warnings gave them just enough time to escape before the trap could be sprung. During the quiet moments between pursuits, Zero began to share more details about her past. She told Jake about the years of captivity and the different owners who had bought and sold her like a piece of property. Some had been merely neglectful, treating her as an expensive pet that required minimal care. Others had been actively cruel, using her empathic gifts to torment her or demanding that she perform tricks for their entertainment. The worst owner had been a scientist who wanted to study her abilities. He had conducted experiments on her brain and nervous system, trying to understand how Vulcan empathy worked and whether it could be artificially enhanced or transferred to other species. The procedures had been painful and invasive, leaving scars both physical and emotional that might never fully heal. Jake listened to these stories with growing anger. He had seen the casual cruelty of war and the indifference of powerful people who treated others as resources to be exploited. But there was something especially evil about the systematic dehumanization that Zero had endured. The way she had been reduced to nothing more than a commodity in the galactic marketplace. As they ran from system to system, Jake began to realize the true scope of what he had gotten himself into. This was not just about one angry noble or one escaped slave. Zero represented something much larger and more threatening to the established order. She was proof that the people being bought and sold in markets across the galaxy were not animals or objects, but thinking, feeling beings with hopes and dreams, and the capacity for love. If word spread that a simple cargo hauler could successfully defy the slave trade, it might inspire others to do the same. If people started to see slaves as individuals deserving of freedom rather than property to be owned, the entire economic system that depended on their labor might begin to collapse. That was why Macroth was willing to pay such an enormous bounty for their capture. He needed to make sure that Jake's act of defiance did not become a symbol of hope for others who might be considering similar actions. He needed to demonstrate that challenging the existing order would result in consequences so severe that nobody would dare to try it again. But Jake had no intention of making it easy for the hunters. He had spent years moving cargo through some of the most dangerous regions of space, and he knew routes and hideouts that were not listed in any official navigation database. The Iron Heart might not be the fastest or most heavily armed ship in the galaxy, but it was reliable, and it could go places where larger vessels feared to travel. Their closest call came near the Vega system, when a team of Corellian hunters managed to track them to a supply depot hidden in the rings of a gas giant. The Corellians were some of the best bounty hunters in known space, with enhanced reflexes and natural armor that made them nearly impossible to kill in direct combat. Jake and Zero were forced to abandon the Iron Heart and flee through the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the depot's main platform. The hunters followed them through the narrow passages, their heavy footsteps echoing off the metal walls like thunder. It was Zero who saved them in the end. As the Corellians closed in for the capture, she used her empathic powers in a way Jake had never seen before. Instead of simply sensing emotions, she began to project them. Fear and confusion flowed out from her mind like a wave, washing over their pursuers and leaving them disoriented and uncertain. The effect only lasted for a few minutes, but it gave Jake and Zero enough time to reach an escape pod and launch themselves into the chaotic environment of the gas giant's rings. They drifted among the ice and rock fragments for hours, hiding from the hunter's sensors until it was safe to send out a distress signal. A salvage crew found them the next day and agreed to give them passage to the nearest inhabited world. Jake had lost his ship and most of his possessions, but Zero was safe, and that was all that mattered to him as they sat in the cramped passenger compartment of the salvage vessel. Zero looked at Jake with something approaching wonder in her dark eyes. She told him that she had never had anyone willing to sacrifice so much for her welfare. In all her years of captivity, she had been surrounded by people who saw her only as a means to an end, a tool to be used for their own benefit. Jake had given up his ship, his career, and his financial security just to keep her free. He had put himself in mortal danger without asking for anything in return except the knowledge that she was no longer suffering. This kind of selfless behavior was so foreign to her experience that she was still struggling to understand it. Jake tried to explain that helping others was just what humans did when they saw injustice being committed. He told her about the concept of doing the right thing even when it was difficult or costly, and how some principles were worth defending regardless of the personal consequences. But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew that their situation was becoming desperate. They had no ship, very little money, and enemies throughout the galaxy who wanted to see them captured or killed. Sooner or later, their luck would run out and the hunters would find them. When that happened, Jake was determined to make sure that Zero at least had a chance to escape. She deserved to live her own life and make her own choices, free from the chains that had bound her for so long. If protecting her freedom meant sacrificing his own life, then that was a price he was willing to pay. New Amarillo was not the kind of place that appeared on tourist maps or luxury travel guides. The frontier colony existed on the edge of civilized space, where corporate law held little power and people made their own rules. The main settlement consisted of prefabricated buildings scattered across a wide valley, connected by dusty roads that turned to mud when the seasonal rains came. Jake and Zero arrived on a freight transport that carried supplies to the Outer Rim colonies. They had spent their last credits on passage to this remote world, hoping to find some refuge from the hunters who continued to pursue them across the galaxy. Jake had heard that New Amarillo was the kind of place where people did not ask too many questions about your past, as long as you were willing to work hard and contribute to the community. The colony was run by Mayor Lisa Stone, a tough woman in her 50s, who had led the original settlement expedition 20 years earlier. She had steel-gray hair and weathered hands that showed the scars of a lifetime spent building something from nothing in the harsh frontier environment. When Jake and Zero walked into her office, she studied them both with sharp eyes that missed very little. Jake told her part of the truth. He said they were refugees fleeing from corporate persecution, and that they needed a place to start over. He offered to work in the mines or the repair shops, using the technical skills he had learned during his years as a cargo hauler. All they wanted was a chance to live quietly without looking over their shoulders every day. Lisa listened to his story without interrupting, but Jake could tell she suspected there was more to their situation than he was revealing. New Amarillo had become home to many people who were running from something, and the mayor had developed good instincts about who could be trusted and who might bring trouble to her community. What convinced her to give them a chance was Zira herself. The young Vulcan had said very little during their conversation, but her empathic abilities allowed her to sense the genuine care and protection that Lisa felt for the colonists under her authority. This was a leader who truly wanted what was best for her people, not someone who sought power for personal gain. Zero spoke quietly to Lisa in the common trade language, telling her that she could sense the mayor's good intentions and honest nature. She also mentioned that there were children in the colony who were frightened by strange dreams and nightmares, and that she might be able to help them using her natural empathic gifts. Lisa was intrigued by this offer. The colony had been experiencing problems with some of the younger children, who complained of bad dreams and unexplained fears that kept them awake at night. The colony's medical officer had found no physical cause for these symptoms, and the parents were becoming increasingly worried about their children's mental health. She agreed to give Jake and Zira temporary housing in exchange for work in the community. Jake was assigned to the maintenance crew that kept the colony's power, generators, and water recycling systems running smoothly. Zira began working with the children, using her abilities to help calm their fears and teach them techniques for managing anxiety and stress. For several weeks, it seemed like they might finally have found a safe haven. Jake enjoyed the physical work and the satisfaction of helping to build something positive and lasting. Zira blossomed in her role as a counselor and teacher, finding purpose in using her gifts to heal rather than simply endure. But their peace was shattered when a messenger ship arrived with devastating news. Corporate survey teams had discovered rich deposits of rare minerals beneath New Amarillo's surface. The mining rights to the entire system had been sold to a major extraction company that planned to strip mine the planet regardless of the impact on the existing colony. The colonists were given 30 days to evacuate their homes and relocate to a resettlement facility on a less desirable world. Any structures or equipment left behind would become property of the mining company. There would be no compensation for the years of work the colonists had invested in building their community. Lisa called a town meeting to discuss their options. Most of the colonists wanted to fight the corporate takeover, but they lacked the legal resources and political connections to challenge such a powerful entity through official channels. A few suggested that they should accept the relocation offer and try to rebuild somewhere else, but the majority refused to abandon everything they had worked so hard to create. As the debate continued, Zero stood up and asked permission to speak. Many of the colonists had never heard her voice before, and the room fell silent as she walked to the front of the meeting hall. She told them about her homeworld and what had happened to her people when the mining companies came. She described the crystal cities that had been reduced to rubble and the gardens that had been poisoned by chemical runoff. She spoke of families torn apart and children left orphaned when their parents tried to resist a corporate invasion. But, most importantly, she showed them exactly what she had experienced, using her empathic abilities in a way that few Velkans had ever attempted. Zira shared her memories with everyone in the room. For a few minutes, each colonist felt the terror and helplessness that she had endured as a child, watching her world die. When the projection ended, there was complete silence in the hall. Men and women who had lived hard lives on the frontier sat with tears in their eyes, finally understanding the true cost of corporate expansion and the human price of treating entire civilizations as obstacles to be removed. Lisa was the first to speak. She said that New Amarillo would not go quietly into the night like Zara's homeworld had. They would stand and fight, using every legal and practical means at their disposal to protect their community. If the mining company wanted their planet, they would have to take it by force. The vote was unanimous. Every adult colonist agreed to resist the corporate takeover, even knowing that they were risking everything they had built together. Jake felt a surge of pride as he watched these ordinary people choose to stand up against overwhelming odds, rather than surrender their freedom. But their defiance attracted attention from sources they had not expected. Within days of the town meeting, bounty hunters began arriving in the system. Lord Macroth had learned about Jake and Zira's presence on New Amarillo, and he saw an opportunity to claim his prize while the colonists were distracted by their fight with the mining company. The first attack came at dawn when a small force of mercenaries tried to capture Jake and Zero during their morning walk around the settlement's perimeter. Jake's military training saved them as he spotted the ambush before they walked into it, but the message was clear. The hunters had found them, and there would be no more running. Lisa gathered the colony's leadership council for an emergency meeting. Jake expected her to ask him and Zero to leave, in order to protect the other colonists from the violence that was sure to follow. Instead, she surprised him by offering them full citizenship in New Amarillo and the protection that came with it. She explained that the colony had been founded by people who refused to accept injustice, whether it came from corporate greed or criminal exploitation. Jake had risked everything to free one person from slavery, and now the colonists were willing to risk everything to protect both of them from those who would drag them back into captivity. The council voted to grant Jake and Zira emergency citizenship, and to treat any attempt to capture them as an act of war against the entire community. They began preparations to defend the colony against both the mining company's security forces and Makroth's bounty hunters. Jake tried to organize their defenses using his experience from the colony wars. The settlement was located in a valley that could be easily defended if they controlled the high ground around its perimeter. The colonists had mining explosives that could be used to create barriers and obstacles for attacking forces. Most importantly, they had the advantage of fighting for their homes and families, while their enemies were motivated only by money. Zero worked with the colonists to coordinate their efforts and maintain morale during the tense days of preparation. Her empathic abilities allowed her to sense fear and doubt among the defenders and help them work through their concerns. She also served as an early warning system, detecting hostile intentions from approaching forces long before conventional sensors could identify specific threats as they waited for the inevitable attack. Jake reflected on how much his life had changed since that day on Nexus Station. He had started as a simple cargo hauler, trying to make an honest living in a corrupt galaxy. Now he found himself at the center of a conflict that might determine whether ordinary people could stand up to the powerful interests that sought to control their lives. But looking around at the faces of the colonists as they prepared for battle, Jake knew he had made the right choice. These were good people who deserved to live in freedom and peace. If fighting for them meant putting his own life at risk, then that was a risk worth taking. The final message from Lord Makroth arrived on the last day before the attack. He demanded that the colonists surrender Jake and Zero within 24 hours, or face the consequences of harboring fugitives from galactic justice. His terms were simple and non-negotiable. Lisa's response was even simpler. She told Makroth's messenger that New Amarillo did not recognize the authority of slavers and criminals, regardless of their titles or wealth. If he wanted to take their citizens, he would have to come and get them himself. The battle for New Amarillo was about to begin. Lord Makroth arrived with a fleet that blocked out the stars above New Amarillo. His personal command ship was a massive vessel designed to intimidate anyone who dared to oppose him, surrounded by smaller attack craft and troop transports. The mining company had also sent security forces to deal with the colonist rebellion, creating an overwhelming display of military power that should have ended the conflict before it began. Jake stood on the colony's central watchtower and studied the enemy forces through his field glasses. He counted at least 200 professional soldiers and an unknown number of robotic combat units. The colonists had 67 adults capable of fighting and a collection of mining equipment that had been hastily converted into weapons. By any reasonable calculation, they were about to be completely destroyed. But Jake had learned during the colony wars that reasonable calculations did not always predict the outcome of battles. Sometimes the side with fewer guns and less training found ways to win because they were fighting for something that mattered more than money or conquest. The attack began at sunrise with orbital bombardment designed to break the colonists' will to resist. Energy beams and explosive shells rained down on the settlement's outer defenses, turning prefabricated buildings into twisted metal and scattered debris. The noise was deafening, and the ground shook like an earthquake with each impact. Jake had expected this opening move and prepared for it by evacuating the civilian population to underground shelters that had been carved out of the hillsides around the valley. The defenders took cover in reinforced positions, that had been designed to withstand the kind of heavy weapons their enemies were using. When the bombardment ended, ground troops moved down from the hills in organized formations. They advanced with professional discipline and superior equipment, expecting to find a broken and demoralized enemy waiting for them in the ruins of the colony. Instead, they found Jake Morrison and 66 other people who refused to give up without a fight. The colonists used every advantage they could find, from hidden explosive charges that turned narrow mountain passes into death traps to improvised weapons that caught the attackers by surprise. Zira moved among the defenders like a guardian angel, using her empathic abilities to coordinate their actions and warn of incoming threats. She could sense the fear and confusion of enemy soldiers when they realized they were facing much stiffer resistance than expected. She could also feel the determination of her fellow colonists as they fought for their homes and families. The battle raged for 3 days. Professional soldiers with advanced weapons and armor found themselves locked in deadly combat with miners and farmers, who had never expected to become warriors. But the colonists knew every rock and tree in their valley, and they used that knowledge to offset the technical advantages of their enemies. Jake led counterattacks against enemy positions, drawing on his military experience to identify weaknesses in their formations and tactics. He had trained some of the colonists in basic combat techniques during the weeks leading up to the battle, but most of what they accomplished came from raw courage and desperate necessity. On the second night of fighting, Lord Macrith himself came down to the surface to demand Jake's surrender. The alien noble was accompanied by an elite guard unit wearing powered armor that could deflect most small arms fire. He believed that a show of personal authority would convince the colonists to give up their futile resistance. He was wrong. The colonists had heard Zara's stories about what happened to people who fell into Macrith's hands, and they were not willing to hand over anyone to that fate. When the alien lord demanded to speak with Jake, Mayor Lisa Stone met him instead at the settlement's main gate. She told Macrith that New Amarillo had voted to grant full citizenship to Jake Morrison and Zira, which meant they were under the colony's protection according to local law. If he wanted to take them, he would have to kill every other colonist first, and the people of New Amarillo were prepared to make that as expensive as possible. Macroth responded with threats and promises of even greater violence if the colonists continued to defy him. But Lisa stood her ground, backed by 24 armed defenders who had positioned themselves around the meeting area. The alien noble was forced to return to his command ship without his prize, humiliated by a group of frontier farmers who refused to be intimidated. The turning point came on the 3rd day when Zira made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A squad of Macroth's elite troops had broken through the colony's outer perimeter and was advancing. On the shelter where the children and elderly colonists were hiding, Jake was pinned down by enemy fire and could not reach them in time to help. Zira used her empathic powers in a way that no Velkin had ever attempted before. Instead of simply sensing emotions or projecting gentle feelings, she reached deep into her own traumatic memories and unleashed them like a weapon. Every moment of pain and terror and helplessness that she had experienced during her years of captivity flowed out of her mind in a concentrated wave of psychic energy. The attacking soldiers were overwhelmed by the sudden flood of alien emotions. They experienced firsthand what it felt like to be powerless and afraid, to have no control over their own fate, to be treated as nothing more than property by people who saw them as less than human. The shock was so intense that several of them collapsed immediately, while others fled in panic from an enemy they could not understand or fight. The effort left Zira unconscious for several hours, but it had saved the lives of dozens of innocent people. When she finally woke up in the colony's medical center, she found Jake sitting beside her bed with a mixture of relief and concern on his face. He told her what her sacrifice had accomplished. The sudden collapse of the elite assault team had created a gap in Macroth's battle plan that the colonists were able to exploit. They had launched a coordinated counterattack that drove the remaining enemy forces back to their landing zones and inflicted heavy casualties on the professional soldiers. More importantly, word of the colonists' successful resistance had begun to spread through the galactic communication networks. Other frontier worlds that were facing similar threats from corporate expansion were taking notice of what had happened on New Amarillo. Some were beginning to organize their own defensive preparations, inspired by the example of a small colony that had refused to surrender. Lord Macroth found himself facing a choice he had not expected. He could continue the assault and probably succeed in capturing or killing Jake and Zira. But the cost would be enormous, and the political consequences might be even worse. The story of his battle with the colonists was already becoming a symbol of resistance against the slave trade and corporate exploitation. On the fourth day, Macroth's fleet withdrew from New Amarillo's orbit. The alien noble had decided that the price of victory was too high, especially since his real goal had been to make an example that would discourage others from defying his authority. Instead, his attack on the colony had become an example of successful resistance that might inspire even more people to stand up against injustice. The colonists celebrated their victory, but they knew the fight was not over. The mining company still claimed legal rights to their world, and there would be more battles in the future. However, they had proven that ordinary people could resist, even overwhelming odds when they were fighting for something they truly believed in. Jake recovered from his injuries over the following weeks, helped by the colony's medical staff and by Zira's gentle empathic healing abilities. He had been wounded several times during the battle, but none of his injuries were life-threatening. The scars would remain as reminders of what they had accomplished together. Zira took longer to heal from the psychic trauma of using her abilities as a weapon. She had violated one of the most fundamental principles of her people by deliberately causing harm to other sentient beings, even in self. Jake and Lisa worked together to help her understand that sometimes violence was necessary to protect innocent lives, and that her actions had saved dozens of people who could not save themselves. As spring returned to New Amarillo, other refugees began arriving on the colony world. They came from dozens of different species and backgrounds, united only by their desire to live in freedom rather than as property owned by others. Some were escaped slaves like Zira, while others were simply people who had run afoul of powerful interests and needed a place to start over. Jake found himself serving as the colony's security chief, using his military experience to help train the growing population in defensive tactics. He also worked with Lisa to establish contact with other frontier worlds that were facing similar threats, sharing information and resources to help them prepare for their own battles. Zero became the colony's counselor and teacher, helping traumatized refugees learn to trust again and find purpose in their new lives. Her empathic abilities made her uniquely suited to understand the emotional needs of people who had survived terrible experiences, and her own journey from slavery to freedom gave her credibility that no amount of training could provide. The mining company eventually gave up its claims to New Amarillo, after facing coordinated resistance from dozens of colony worlds that had banded together for mutual protection. The corporate executives decided that the political and financial costs of forcing the issue were not worth the potential profits from the planet's mineral deposits. Lord Macroth never returned to claim his prize, but Jake and Zero knew he had not forgotten about them. Somewhere in the galaxy, the alien noble was still planning his revenge and waiting for an opportunity to strike, but they were no longer running or hiding from the threat he represented. They had found something worth fighting for, and people willing to stand beside them in that fight. 5 years after the battle for New Amarillo, Jake stood once again on the colony's central watchtower and looked out over the valley where he had chosen to make his home. The settlement had grown into a small city with permanent buildings and thriving businesses. Thousands of people had found refuge there, creating a diverse community that proved different species could live and work together in peace. Zira joined him on the observation platform, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to value herself and her contributions to the world around her. She was no longer the frightened girl he had rescued from the auction block, but a strong woman who used her gifts to heal rather than merely endure. As they watched the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded their valley, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this place. He had started as a simple cargo hauler, trying to make an honest living in a corrupt galaxy. Now he was part of something much larger, a growing movement of people who refused to accept injustice and exploitation as the natural order of things. The galaxy was still a dangerous place, filled with those who preyed on the weak and defenseless. But it was also home to countless individuals who were willing to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. Jake had learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not by professional soldiers with advanced weapons, but by ordinary people who simply refused to give up. And in the end, that was what made humans special in a galaxy full of wonders and terrors. Not their technology or their physical abilities, but their stubborn insistence that everyone deserved a chance at freedom and happiness, regardless of their species or background or past mistakes. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above New Amarillo, Jake Morrison smiled and put his arm around Zira's shoulders. They had found their home among the stars, and they had helped others find theirs as well. It was not the life either of them had planned, but it was a life worth living. The battle for freedom never really ended, but at least now they were not fighting it alone.